we're live, CJ.
Hello, and welcome back to the InterDrone Podcast, your 30,000-foot view of the commercial drone industry. It is Thursday, December 10th, 2020. My name is CJ Smith, joined today with Michael Peel, chairman of InterDrone, and our special guest. Really excited to have him on, especially today, David Benowitz, head of research at DroneAnalyst. DroneAnalyst just released the 2020 drone market sector report this morning. So really excited to have David on and talk through some of the findings and key takeaways. We'll put some links to both a blog post, which talks about some of the findings in the report, and then also a link for you to actually purchase the report as well. So, David, thanks so much for being here this morning. For anybody that maybe isn't familiar with DroneAnalyst and then the annual report you guys put out, can you talk a little bit about how many years you guys have been doing this report, maybe the history of DroneAnalyst, and then I know you joined not terribly long ago, so talk about kind of you joining the team and what this year's been like.
Yeah. Thanks, CJ and Mike, for having me on and just for hosting this podcast and kind of bringing it to a much more kind of interactive platform on Twitch. So DroneAnalyst was founded back in 2016 by my predecessor, Colin Snow, really focusing on producing realistic, conservative looks at the drone industry and kind of seeing what's fluff versus what's reality in the market. And so with that in mind, we've been putting out annual reports, which is based off of a large survey of stakeholders across the drone industry to really assess what's the real status of the industry. How often are people actually using drones? How much money are people actually making? What brands are they buying, et cetera? So we've been doing this since 2016, and this, just today we're putting out our 2020 version of that report. And I'm excited to kind of share a little bit of tidbits behind, what are those trends that are really shaping the industry today.
Awesome. I know we've worked with DroneAnalyst for years. I would say like kind of our initial list growth was based off of our work with Colin to create white papers. We chose him because he had a really sober view. And I have to say, David, like when you first took over, there's always like cautious trepidation, like what's the brand going to be like now, and can he really replace Colin? And the answer is always no to that. But like I'm really impressed with your ability to kind of define your own voice, take your expertise from being kind of inside the Leviathan and turning that into real market insights. So we're really excited to have you on today.
Yeah, thanks. Obviously it's hard shoes to step into from Colin's, just in the beginning, but it's, thank you. I very much appreciate that kind of kind words. And, I hope, we can do a lot more in the years to come.
And David, you mentioned, the kind of the broad swath of data that this report is pulling in. You guys surveyed over 1,300 people and it looks like 39 industries, 110 countries. Can you talk about just the kind of the mindset for trying to capture, I guess, the global, kind of some global insight into the drone industry?
Yeah. So we've kind of modified a little bit our approach compared to previous years. And one of the big focuses is really on focusing a lot more on a global approach instead of more centered on the US. Obviously we've seen a lot of growth in the US market just first because of the FAA kind of taking a lot of big steps in those early years before other regions, other countries really had as progressive policies as the 107. And so, from previous years, we've had maybe 75-80% of our respondents from North America region, so US and Canada. Mm-hmm. And now we're kind of seeing about 40, almost 50% of our audience is coming from outside of those regions. So, this year we're releasing a much more global voice in our survey, a more global voice in our report as well. And so we're really excited to kind of dig into all those different perspectives and all those different views. So, we kind of split up our audience into drone buyers, service providers, and then business agency users. And obviously there's overlap there, right? Service providers and business agency users do purchase drones, and they also purchase software, which is kind of our last category. But that's kind of how we divvy up this audience.
Great. Yeah, and we're going to dive into this kind of following the blog post. I'll put this in the chat now, but you broke it down into 4 different sections. Business adoption matures, security concerns over Chinese-made products, hardware market becomes more interesting, and COVID-19's unequal impact. So I think that's a kind of a great, just some great kind of broad topics that we can dive into. I know every week on the podcast, we typically talk about a couple of articles. There's just one that we want to bring up today. and especially Mike wanted to jump into this a little bit. So new satellite images show that the Arecibo Observatory before and after its violent collapse in Puerto Rico. So Mike, I know there was drone imagery capturing the collapse of this telescope. What really kind of triggered you when you saw this?
Well, the thing that I noticed right away was, well, there was a drone observing something right before a critical failure, so that made me think about lives being saved, right? So I want to pull up the video. Got to get to it first, though. Because I think, a picture's worth 1,000 words here. So this is from the National Science Foundation. And just watching that cable break, you have no idea how much force is on that. And there it goes. I mean, it's just kind of striking to think that, how do you even maintain something at that scale prior to drones? It seems like it's like a no-brainer now.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, certainly. Imagine, somebody up there at the top climbing there, scaffold set up, people. To get this drone footage a few months prior and actually maybe prevent this from happening. But, it was great to see nonetheless. And it's kind of terrifyingly stunning footage.
Yeah, were they using drones regularly in the first place, and that's why they had it on hand? And then, at that point, are they doing enough with them? Are they just doing kind of video spot checks like that, or are they at the level of doing kind of deeper kind of 3D modeling scans and trying to find kind of issues ahead of time? We don't have any interviews, so we don't know, but do you feel like those practices would help prevent something like that, or is it's just kind of at some point there's going to be critical failures and it's more about just protecting people from having to check it out when we sense that one is coming?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. But, this is very similar to a power line inspection, just for example. There's lines being strung, there's areas that are holding the lines together. If there's one failure at one area, it's going to kind of affect the chain as well. And, in those sections, I've seen very up close power line inspections, and just like getting down to the level of, this screw is loose, this area is overheating. If you have thermal imagery as well, you'll start to see that literally tension build within the system, specifically with overheating elements that, you just can't get without, really close drone photography, drone inspection data.
Well, I just want to remind everyone, we are coming to you live this morning talking about the 2020 Drone Market Sector Report. Please, if you're tuning in on Twitch, YouTube, or Facebook, ask your questions. We'll get those answered. We'll put this blog post in the chat, and this is kind of the more or less the script that we'll be following today. And as I mentioned earlier, this report was broken down into 4 different sections. So business adoption matures, security concerns around Chinese-made products, hardware market becomes more interesting, and finally, COVID-19's unequal impact. So let's jump into this first. We're calling Force 1. So business adoption matures. So some of the points that you made, David, the larger drone market is shifting increasingly towards industrial application, and this is reflected in our data with an increased proportion of businesses and agency users. This maturity is reflected in their budgets, with spending on drones and drone-related services increasing significantly among those with the drone program for 2 years or longer. However, despite this growth and maturity, we aren't necessarily seeing the explosion that many forecasts had predicted years before, with fleets remaining at moderate sizes. So I think that's kind of interesting. One thing we've been seeing a little bit this year has been consolidation in the industry. But I think the point that you just made right there is that people that are invested in the drone industry, they are increasing their investment. But the other flip side is we aren't seeing maybe as many kind of new businesses kind of join into the industry. It just seems like the ones that are already using drones are just doubling down on them. What were some of your other kind of takeaways from business adoption and the maturity of the drone industry?
Yeah, there's this one data point I haven't included in there, but I think is quite telling over all of this kind of trend that we've seen. When we looked at our previous data, especially just 2 years ago, when we saw how many of these business agency users had just started a drone program within the past 2 years, that number was, 3/4, just above 3/4. And now that's down to about 50% today. So this is a really big shift towards, people with drone programs for longer. That's common sense, right? If you take data 2 years later, you're gonna have more people that have been in the industry for 2 years longer. But it is good to see overall that, we are seeing these drone programs continue to mature. And this kind of report and a lot more of the nuanced data really dives into, as these businesses mature, where are they spending money? How are they actually building out their drone program? Just because at the beginning of the industry, it was very much, a lot of them taking the same guesses that we were, vendors not really knowing what was the right software category they should even be in, what was the right hardware category they should be building in. And now we're kind of seeing it mature out. We're understanding, how much businesses are willing to spend, what type of fleet sizes they're having, and a lot more.
So, I mean, is there still room for innovation though? For me personally, like, I haven't felt the same kind of, buzz of the kind of 2015 era of the industry, and maturity is awesome. It actually means real dollars, real plans, and all that. But I mean, is there still room for something else to pop up, or is that something else not going to be small UAS? Is it going to be in a different sector, like air taxis? Is it going to be actually just a software equation? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people in the early days were always thinking about some type of drone rush, kind of like a gold rush in many ways. And we would all take the drones flying, and in a few years, we'd have millions of drones flying over every house in America or around the world. We're not seeing that type of growth. To kind of answer your question, we are seeing some areas of growth, like specifically in the European Union and in India, where kind of new regulations are coming into place to really enable that business adoption to really increase, in the short term. But we're not seeing necessarily fleets of massive sizes. Even just from the news that we see in the drone industry, you can probably handpick a few that are reaching 1,000 drones, in fleets like Corteva and Komatsu, et cetera. But the majority of drone adoption is going to stay at this small fleet size and really kind of scale out that way, just via maturing, spending more money. So kind of is there space for innovation in the market? My answer to that question is I don't think the full drone tech stack is fully solved yet, and we'll continue to see innovation. Are we going to see that many new players into the market? Probably not. If we look even at the hardware space, it's pretty competitive today. We're seeing a lot of new entrants. Do I expect we'll see a lot more new entrants in the few years to come? No, we'll probably see consolidation across both the hardware and the software sides. So
should we rename the show This Week in Drone Deploy or This Week in Pix4D and just call it a day? Is that, are we going to see anything on the hardware side?
Every week,
What?
1 week is This Week in Pix4D. The next week is This Week in Drone Deploy.
Right.
And
at least there's competition still.
DJI to pay for once a year, and
yeah, this way, we're not just talking about like Fang every podcast, right? There's still actually decent amount of diversity though, right? But the players are really starting to silo, is what you're saying.
Especially in the software market. In the hardware market, we are seeing kind of increased competition, which I think we'll get to a little bit later. But yeah, in the software side, it's kind of stagnating. I think we'll see, as kind of UTM comes into place, some shakeups there, because it'll kind of be who's working with which government, and it's going to be global, right? So just because one supplier is chosen for the US to be a UTM service supplier doesn't mean they're going to be the leader in Australia. So I think we'll kind of see that the world divvied up that way, and that's where we'll see a lot of interest in the software market. But yeah, there's kind of, in the software space, at least a lot fewer players than if you look back a few years ago.
I think another point you made here is there's money to be made for vendors and service providers, but it's through identifying the right market vertical, providing real value, not riding a massive drone wave. Yeah. So, yeah, how do you see these service providers really picking out their niche? Do you think that's the best way for them to create a sustainable model and something with some longevity, as opposed to trying to solve, or serve multiple markets and multiple industry verticals?
Yeah. I do think it is more about finding your small niche, and you need to kind of find where people are willing to spend, geographically, where are they at as well. And also building up those relationships. That's very typical in B2B. I think even if you look at like the cloud service market, you'll start to see this kind of long tail of these smaller players who are just very niche and kind of very focused as well. And these SIs who are kind of building on top of that. So yeah, I mean, it is very much about finding your niche and kind of finding where both you yourself can develop a lot of expertise, but also where you can eventually make more sustainable income. A lot of our reports and I think it's been well reported on in the past as well, is just these service providers have really struggled to make a very sustainable income, especially if you consider, the price of the drone as well. We're not seeing too many of these service providers making, enough income to really carry a business that is a one-man band. And so I think that's something these players need to really find out, is what is that niche that I need to be in, or is it maybe moving to a company, or is maybe just the market not big enough to fit everyone in it on the services side.
Mm-hmm. And you touched on hardware being a little more competitive right now than software, and I think that's a great segue into kind of the second bullet, the second force, security concerns around Chinese-made products. This is probably not new news to most of our listeners, but you really broke down like who is really impacted by this, which I think is really important and really valuable information. So among drone buyers, over a quarter were impacted by these security claims. And of those impacted, they were more likely to see concerns that slowed or paused their purchases, as opposed to driving them to purchase alternative products. So I think what the insight here is that just because you're banning Chinese-made drones doesn't mean these people are just going to buy something else. It really means that they may not be buying anything at all, or at least just putting some things on pause until they can kind of figure out how to move forward compliantly.
Yeah, exactly. And this question was asked of people who did purchase in the past 12 months. So, we can assume that percentage of people who slowed or paused is probably much higher. And that actual impact is maybe a little bit higher as well. But, to me, to say that a quarter of all drone sales are impacted by security concerns, is pretty worrying. When we look at the market today, it's kind of like we've opened a Pandora's box. No one really has the security the security solution. I was even seeing a drone, small U.S. new manufacturer of drone hardware, kind of point out in their press release of a new product that they manufacture all their components in the U.S. So that they take cybersecurity seriously. Where your drone is made is important as a selling point. It has nothing to do with cybersecurity. So we kind of need to start separating these two. And, hopefully having some type of government body or some type of industry body really come together and say, we're either moving towards a more open source security standards, or we're moving towards a very specific security standard. And, who should be really following this specific security standard? Is it all infrastructure utility companies have no internet connection at all? I think a lot of them will complain about that, but, if that's the level they need to hit, it kind of needs to be stated in the industry. With all this uncertainty, it's causing a lot more harm than necessarily benefits, if we see the benefit as driving new players into the market.
Right. I think another interesting point there too is we had Richard Lopez on the podcast, and so while this Chinese ban is specific to federal funds, his fleet is not purchased with federal funds, but a lot of his clients may be government bodies, and therefore he isn't able to use Chinese-made foreign-made drones on those clients. So I think that shows you that the ripple effect is more than just federal agencies who are purchasing DJI drones, right? It expands much more. And I think to your insight here that people are slowing down their purchasing, I think, that's another example of that going outside of just the federal funds being used.
Yeah. Also just general anxiety from his management or people who are managing those things that don't know the exact details. It's like, shut it down. I hear it's scary, right? So we actually got a question from the great Vic Moss, one of the best pilot advocates out there, and I believe Drone
Agreed.
U instructor. So how will the exclusion of the country of origin restriction from the final NDAA alleviate most of those concerns?
It won't, and that's kind of what I think the data shows is that there is the country of origin ban, and it's great to see that removed and off the table. In general, country of origin bans are not good for the market overall, and will have a lot of other negative impacts across the whole industry. But what we're just measuring here are concerns over security concerns. The fact that the DHS has made a claim that you need to be very aware of when you're using a Chinese product, not just to federal agencies, but to all drone pilots. The fact that we see the DOI move away completely from Chinese-made drones as kind of a precaution of potentially giving China access to where a wildfire might be, or where a specific national park might be. That's the larger concern that has me concerned, is just what is the trickle effects of the rhetoric that we're seeing around drone security that isn't really measured by a country of origin ban, or removing a country of origin ban, which is great that it happened.
I mean, I've always wanted to hear more detail about the specifics, and I understand the data security, but sometimes it seems like the endpoint should just be that company's IT, rather than kind of this broader scope kind of I would say fear, because the further away you get from that technical person, the less understanding of what the actual vulnerability is, and therefore the ability to close any potential vulnerability gets shut off, and sometimes the whole program gets shut down despite the vulnerability being able to be stopped further down the chain, right? Like, do you use an app that, or do you, I mean, even if you're not using a DJI drone, but are you using a separate app to control it? Are you creating your own software layer on top of it? Like there might be other kind of courses of action you could take that don't require you to completely shut off using a Chinese drone. And I think the only thing that I'm still concerned about, I don't see it going away, is it's just like taking the broad stroke and saying, well, they're all from China, we're scared. So maybe we'll build our own program here. And I think sometimes you hear this in terms as if that it's one or the other. We can start building and investing in drones in the United States. We can throw lots of money into it if we're really interested. But you got to actually meet market demand, and it's also very, very hard to compete with Chinese manufacturing because of all the logistics that are logistical benefits you get from being so close to this established manufacturing base. But if you're going to make that choice, then you got to make a choice on a category, and you got to make that drone for that category and get the entire United States backing it.
Yeah. No, agreed. I think you made a lot of really good points there. And there's a lot of investment happening by the DoD and VC as well with Skydio, and then a lot of blue SUAS players. So it'll be exciting to see how it kind of rolls out. We are still at the beginning phase of this kind of journey. To your point about kind of enterprises taking more control about their data security, in the long run, you're correct. In the long run, I think we'll have a lot of solutions like that. And I think, Kitty Hawk and Drone Deploy and a lot of others, and even DJI actually have kind of championed a very similar approach to kind of let your IT manager kind of build it out yourself. But I think you'd be surprised at how few of these drone programs actually have significant buy-in from their IT departments and actually have the budget to kind of build that out through a vendor as well. So we're kind of in the early stages still. So it's going to take some time for them to kind of reach that level of agreement. But, you can imagine, for example, in Richard's situation, that, there isn't this standard set that you can fly Chinese products if you have all of the data going to your own server. That standard isn't set yet. So what if he makes that investment and then kind of the goalposts change? So you can also see why that might just pause all of his decision making in the first place. Look, let me lock my fleet. I'm not buying any new drones, not getting rid of them. Hopefully they let me still operate. But there's no point in which I can go forward in my investment.
Right.
And that's kind of the worst case scenario for the industry in many ways.
Yeah, no, I agree totally. I was going to ask you guys, what do you think has actually made a bigger impact on the industry? The actual ban itself, or just the rhetoric of the ban floating around and kind of giving everybody maybe some anxieties or concerns, or just, or just stopping somebody who was maybe going to make a proposal to their to their boss, hey, I want to look into this technology.
Yeah, well, the ban never went into effect. So the answer is
clearly
the threat of the ban itself.
Right.
Because we're already seeing a lot of impacts and kind of the effect throughout the market.
Right. So we just talked about.
Even if it came into effect, even if it came into effect, there'll always be some type of federal procurement rules that will prioritize domestic suppliers. That's pretty normal. So I think the question is, how large of the market is this actually impacting? The answer is going to be relatively small. I think even if the ban happened in the first place, we would see a larger impact just through the rhetoric than anything else. Just because people are questioning, can I use a Chinese drone over federal land? I mean, the answer would probably still be yes underneath NDA, although don't quote me on that if the ban was in place. But, there would just be so much more questions over, what are those boundaries?
Whatever percentages it is, even if it was only 2%, 1%, like this is an emerging market, and any slowing of the kind of upward mobility kind of hurts, right? I think we'll still be having this conversation though into the next administration, as it seems there's very much bipartisan support and concern about basically critical infrastructure or emerging technologies being completely in the hands of China. And diversity will probably be good if we can kind of just get our hands around actually supporting business the right way to do that. And so I think that conversation will continue to evolve. Any thoughts based on kind of what I'm saying there?
Yeah, monopoly is bad. We're talking about a lot of the dirty stuff that kind of gets us there. But, if we were to say the outcome is we have a more competitive and open market, overall, that's good. I'd prefer that it doesn't slow us down, but, we do need to get to something more competitive.
David, looks like we have another question from the audience. He says, hey guys, a little bit newer to the space, but just curious which city or states will likely first adopt or allow large scale drone delivery services?
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. I think we're a little too early to say for sure. I mean, Virginia, North Carolina have been pretty advanced in their adoption and kind of
Nevada.
How they build it out. Nevada as well.
North Carolina, North Dakota.
Yes, and I was really interested in like North Dakota, and then also even New York nowadays are kind of investing in this specific kind of infrastructure along a specific corridor. I think maybe that won't solve the mass within a city drone delivery question, but I think we'll probably see that a little bit more longer range delivery happen first. So yeah, those are all kind of cities to keep in mind. I think we're still a little bit further away until we start seeing that really hit wide scale in any urban environment, but it's quite exciting.
Yeah, I think we'll see it in more rural environments, absolutely first. And you mentioned like North Carolina, and I think Nevada. We see DroneUp do some prescription deliveries in those two places already. Not terribly long distance. I know just a few miles away from these specific pharmacies, but we are already starting to see that, and especially like I said with prescription or some of those kind of more important products. Back to the security concerns. So we said drone buyers over 27% were impacted by the claims. Now, if we're talking about service providers, the report says just under 1/5, so 19% of service providers are impacted. So a little bit less than the buyers. And then of those impacted, they were slightly more likely to have moved to alternative products already. But those who didn't switch reported that these concerns lost them projects or clients. What do you kind of make of those insights?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty big impact when you see a service provider either losing 20%, almost 20% of service providers either losing a job, losing some type of source of revenue, or having to invest $2,000 or more on new hardware that they probably already have capable enough hardware today. So that's kind of a little bit of a loss, or a little bit of a side kind of negative impact there. We are seeing a lot of service providers just don't make that much money. So when we start seeing these $2,000, $3,000, or maybe even a $10,000 hit to their revenue because they have to invest in a new platform, there's probably also a lot of people that aren't captured in this research that are just exiting the market entirely.
And I would imagine that that's kind of on both sides, right? So if you lose the 10,000 because you have to invest in a new airframe, but then you're also not getting clients in the meantime, or you're losing a fifth of your clients in the meantime because of that. So that's a huge impact. It might make your decision on whether or not you close shop and go into a different career, or and what we've seen, actually, I don't know if it's reflected in the report this year, but it's actually more of an older population than you might think for an emerging piece of technology, right? A lot of retirees taking up the mantle, etc. I'd imagine that they would just close up shop and not come back.
Yeah, that's more of a U.S. trend, but you're certainly right.
So we got a compliment from the chat for David. Thanks for taking up. This is from Texas Drone Co. Thanks for taking up the mantle from Colin with his survey. I've been waiting to see the survey results. So happy you're taking up the mantle.
Yeah, happy to share with you.
And he's got a question now, or she's got a question. Do you have any insight into the drone service provider market itself? Is it growing, shrinking, specializing? What's the average revenue, etc.?
Yeah, there's a lot there that is just a lot more nuanced, and you have to kind of go through the report for that, specifically in those findings, like what's the average revenue, et cetera. Overall, we are seeing revenues move a little bit higher, but it's such an insignificant jump up, unfortunately, that it's not worth saying that this slice of the market is necessarily that much healthier. We do suspect, and a survey is not a great way to necessarily measure this, but that the service provider market has had some type of net decrease in overall size, and just a lot of people did exit the space just based on the type of responses we got and kind of the makeup of our survey. So that's kind of like a hypothesis that we have just looking at the data. But I would say overall, like the drone services space, you need to be really careful on what niche you're in and kind of what clients you have. I think there's obviously a market for these higher end service providers, and that won't go away. But it's not necessarily a nice green field of opportunity for new people to come into.
Mm-hmm. And when you say the higher end service providers, can you give some of the examples or talk through like what types of clients those larger scale service providers might be having?
Yeah, they're mostly working in surveying, mapping, and utilities and these type of applications, more in the industrial space. But we are still seeing in the creative side of things, there isn't a higher tier market there as well.
David, can you go long? Because I have the feeling with the questions coming in, we might end up going a little bit over time.
What do you mean, keep on diving into?
Yeah, because I think we're only halfway through your report, and we got questions coming in through the chat. So just making sure you could go a little over if possible.
Oh, yes, for sure. Yeah.
Well, he is dialing in from Beijing, so I don't know what time it is over
Shenzhen,
there. Shenzhen, sorry. Yeah. Let's talk about this third force, and I think this. Well, you, David, I'd like to hear your insight, whether you think this was impacted by the potential ban. But the third force is hardware market becoming more interesting. So from the report, ever since you guys had started collecting drone market share data, DJI remained at the top of the market, 50% of the market in 2016, 72% of the market in 2017, 74% in 2018. And then I think you guys found this year, DJI remaining dominant, but new market players and security concerns knocked them down a peg, dropping their market share to 69%. So that's still a tremendous amount of market share, but for a company that we've seen really dominate the market, this is the first year we've actually seen their market share decrease. I guess you mentioned new market players and security concerns maybe causing this, but what are some other kind of insight you draw from DJI's market share slightly decreasing?
Yeah. So, I mean, from the data we see, it's mostly due to these security concerns, and then also just a lot more new players having kind of different offerings, different unique selling points on that side as well. I mean, we talked about this on the last time I was on the podcast, but, Skydio's product is, specifically the consumer one is kind of a different piece. It's a different piece of hardware. It's not necessarily going to capture the same exact type of consumer that you would for a DJI drone. In general, they're going to have a different workflow, a different reason why they're buying this type of more autonomous drone, which overall is a net positive for the market. So we are kind of seeing a lot more of these new players enter in, from kind of the graph there. And I think there's the graph on the blog itself, if anyone wants to pull it up. And I think it might be actually on the Twitch too. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think I have that. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, there it is.
Perfect. You can kind of see, Autel, Skydio, and Parrot as kind of like companies that are rising a little bit. What I found the most interesting was specifically this like US slice is incredibly diverse in its makeup. Skydio is a leader in there, but, certainly it looks like there's a lot of other players that could rise in the years to come. FreeFly is the only one there that's really had a stake in the market for a fairly long time. A lot of the rest of those guys are relatively young. And Aireon. And so it'll be interesting to see kind of how they diverge, how they kind of move into new markets, and then also, who potentially exits the market as well. Right. So that's kind of where I see as the most interesting slice of the market. If we look at, for example, the US market share in years previously, they were at the same level as they are today way back in 2017, all because of 3D robotics pretty much. And we're kind of seeing this rebirth to some degree. It's still a small sliver of the market, but it's still great to kind of see this type of direction and trajectory.
Right. How much do you think is just market maturation? So, it seems like DJI was one of the first. It was kind of like that Swiss Army knife. It could do everything. And now we're seeing, as the market matures, as the use cases for drone technology mature, we're seeing, like you said, Skydio, autonomy. There are some markets that is really important for, and some markets where it maybe isn't important for. But how much of, is that component where just people are picking aircraft that are more specific to those use cases that they need, and the DJI, which seem to be more of a one size fits all approach, is maybe we're seeing them not be as prevalent.
Yeah, there's to some degree. We also see a lot of more diverse fleets this year than in previous years as well. So it's maybe more of a lot of people investing in different horses to see which way they can actually scale out with the concerns that are happening today as well. So that's kind of an interesting slice of it too. I think in the long run, we'll kind of see maybe 3 to 5 players really become a lot more competitive against DJI with kind of different approaches. Today I'm saying, Skydio has a very unique approach. Does Parrot and Autel, you look at their new drones, they're pretty comparable to each other. They're kind of the Skydio X2D just without the software. So I'm just kind of interested to see how those companies may pivot into something else. Autel's obviously teased a VTOL drone, and that would be really interesting, if they kind of try and build that kind of space a little bit more. But, a lot of these drones are in the same envelope. I was even looking back at the news. Vesper is selling I think Vesper is the brand, the drone name. I forgot the name of the company. But they are kind of selling their same Blue SUS, small quad with a thermal visual at a 7K price range. Same thing with Parrot, same thing with Autel as well. I'm not convinced that they have a very unique software approach. Skydio is showing that off. So we'll kind of see if they have more unique selling points outside of just, we've kind of have US made hardware at a competitive price with good thermal capabilities, because they all kind of have that.
Right. Let's hold that thought on unique selling points and software. I'll have a follow-up question, but we've got a question from Ramon from Drone Code. So what are your general predictions for the drone industry in 2021 based on the data you're seeing from 2020 here?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's primarily one that we're going to see, increased competition, and hopefully more of these players kind of enter new markets and new segments of the market as well. mostly these new US players and even kind of the French players are more in public safety, this kind of small quad style product. And I think we'll see them branch out and potentially be able to compete more broadly across the range of applications. And then we'll just continue to see market consolidation. In the short term, a lot of these smaller firms are going to need an out. They're going to need to eventually sell, be acquired, be merged together to really have a long-term stake or value in the market. Same thing with the software space as well. So those are kind of the two biggest trends I think we'll see. What we're already seeing in maturity will continue on the business adoption side. When enterprises start using a product and a new technology and see benefits from it, they're going to naturally mature. So that's just a trend we'll see over many years to come.
So back on the kind of point on product differentiation. So Skydio is truly unique, or at least feels that way. It kind of gives you that magic feeling of a piece of tech that's one step ahead, right? But is that value proposition of pure autonomy actually interesting to the commercial market? And I mean, maybe it's only interesting to certain sectors of the market. Is that the case? Am I just imagining that? Or the other side of that, like, are there other ways to differentiate your software that you think the market is asking for that none of the drone manufacturers have actually produced yet?
Yeah. To answer the first question, and I think we speculated on this a lot before as well on our previous podcast, which is, autonomy overall. There's a lot of different levels of autonomy, and I posted a in-depth blog about this, but, so people do value autonomy. What type of autonomy do they value is still a question mark. If you still have to have a pilot, do you value full autonomy or do you value partial autonomy? You probably today value partial autonomy a lot more, but maybe you invest in the platform that can eventually get you there to the full level as well. So it's really a lot of individual decisions. On kind of the other part about where is there opportunity in the space for a lot of them is that, I don't think necessarily that workflows in every application have been figured out from the hardware side and integrated into software as well. And so there's a lot of opportunity for these hardware players to enter there. And I think that's where we'll see a lot of development. Skydio is hiring for a lot of software people on the cloud side of things. I suspect they already figured this out. And I wouldn't be surprised if the rest are as well.
So all about the data again, no longer about the drone.
Yeah. At the beginning of every year of our survey, we always point out, the drone market is really just a data acquisition market. And so we have to see this as flying cameras. And then kind of every assumption is based off of there. I think that's a much more healthy way to look at the market as enterprises looking to do flying camera data acquisition.
That was at least 1/3 of the keynotes at Interdrone 2016 was that message. It's no longer about the drone. So that's not a new thing.
I remember the Intel keynote with, I think the title was, data is the new oil.
Yeah, data is the new oil.
Yeah,
I love the indoor inspection. I was there for that. That was fun.
They really went all out. They basically had like a Disneyland, Islands of Adventure sort of setup with the facade and everything, with dyno damage completed. So it was interesting. I mean, I do miss
like a full.
What were you gonna say?
Oh, it felt like a full takeover from Intel. I was maybe one of 5 DJI employees. Our market share at the time is quite high, and you kind of saw all these new Intel guys. I was like, oh, they were not here before, slowly taking over the show. It was exciting to kind of see that. Just from that perspective was quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, what an interesting story though, that Intel journey from, like, it seems like they were investing mountains of dough into drones, and it just between the CEO kind of fiasco they had, and I guess kind of other evaluations of their place in the market, we didn't see it materialize. Like, their drone was really, really overpriced, right? That was a big kind of hurt at the beginning. I just on some levels I wish it went a little bit differently though. It would have been nice to have like a big name competitor, somebody who could spend that kind of Super Bowl cash, like we were talking about on the FLIR podcast we did together. But Yeah, I guess that's history, right? We'll remember it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Back to autonomous drones, I wonder if for some drone programs or some some organizations who are considering jumping into drone technology, if autonomy is just, it's too unknown, it's too foreign, it's too scary for them. I wonder if they just need to start with something small and something manageable, something more kind of digestible before they can, they need to sell to their boss that this thing is a tool for them, let alone something that's going to start flying around by itself. And so I wonder if if we'll see some of these industries slower to adopt fully autonomous drones until they have maybe a successful implementation of a drone program already.
I mean, it doesn't matter
Yeah.
if that industry is familiar with other forms of autonomy as to whether or not they're just more open to drones or autonomy. Any insights into that? I know that's getting really granular.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, not so much into that level of granular detail on just autonomy. But I think it's an important point. I think just from conversations, an industry may see it only valuable if they go into the full autonomy route, and that's going to really slow them down. Whereas like public safety, these guys in general really start at the lowest level when it comes down to full manual control and move their way up. And I think that's also why we're seeing a lot of these guys adopt now and kind of increase their adoption, is because, with new technology, that's just the way to go. Take it slow.
Mm-hmm.
It's already valuable if it's manual,
Mm-hmm.
and just build up your use cases from there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, enterprise. Colin and I always used to talk that the thing that hurts the enterprise adoption cycle the most is the enterprise adoption cycle. So like people kept talking about it like they were gonna present this amazing product to enterprises that was just gonna make them jump full head first into the drone market, and where the real money is, the larger enterprises, that's a slow game. The cycle is
Yeah.
long.
David,
Yeah. You kind of need one champion in the organization to take it forward. It's hard to scale.
Mm-hmm.
right. We have another question from the chat, David, and Mike too. Do you guys know any companies or projects creating drop-off zones or drop-off zone design products like landing hubs for rooftops? I think we've seen some articles about, if we're going to move forward with drone delivery, it's not necessarily to everyone's doorstep, but it is to these different kind of drone ports or types of areas where drones are meant to land and drop off payload.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen a lot of companies in that space come and go over the years, and mostly going, until we get kind of a standard hardware that someone wants to build their whole business around, or a drone manufacturer goes full deep into that concept, we won't see this really become at that scale. One thing I'll kind of point to that does show that we might have that path is kind of recent investment from Skydio in Wear Robotics. And that type of investment where they're kind of saying, it's within warehouses, but they kind of have the full autonomous setup with like some type of docking system. This type of deep integration, whether it is another third-party company or the first-party company, is really important to eventually unlocking that. Or eventually a DJI or Skydio will just build it all themselves. But I think using these third-party developers will get us there a lot faster.
Right.
Yeah, there's like kind of a lot of factors into that, right? Because you have to have, if we're talking for deliveries or drop-offs at that scale, you really kind of have to have the UTM and regulation equations squared before you'd see any sizable investment to really solve the problem. And then also there's the user interface kind of thing. We're going to see a lot more failures along those lines, I would think, to figure out what's the best way to actually do this, where it fits into most people's homes or is modifiable to a way that it could fit in most people's homes. And ultimately, do we even need it, right? There might be some kind of software solution or kind of tether kind of thing that just makes it irrelevant. So I think there's a long kind of future in seeing kind of people hit the wall on that.
Yeah.
Back to Wear Robotics. I know we wrote an article about that, but for anyone not familiar, it's using Skydio drones in warehouses to move around product, and I think to figure out what needs to be stocked and where. It's funny because I think most of us seen videos of the Amazon warehouses, which are already using robots to fulfill package orders, just not flying. But some interesting innovation, I think, in a really good use case for autonomous drones. While being indoors, I think that's something we might maybe see some more growth in.
That's Ian Smith, right?
Yeah.
Ware Robotics.
Yep, correct. It's Ian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He's been around for a long time. He used to be at Drone Deploy at one point, I think, and he's had the podcast in between and before. Really interesting guy.
I think also it was Wintra or Delaire as well before as well. He's been, a long time drone industry insider. Beats me by quite a few years, I think.
Everybody should look into Ian. He's a great guy, and he's really invested clearly his life in this industry.
David, let's talk about the fourth force, COVID-19's unequal impact. So some of the insight, you guys looked at the impact of COVID-19 on service providers and business and agency users for drones and drone services. Among those two groups, you saw a common thread. An overwhelming majority reported moderately negative impacts, with a small fraction of the market being positively impacted. I think, and we've said this on the podcast many times too, that COVID, a weird silver lining of COVID has been maybe some maturation or progression in the drone industry. But you're pointing out that it seems like most of those impacts were in fact negative. Can you just maybe dive a little bit deeper into kind of some of the impact that you've seen COVID have on the industry, and maybe even to like which segments of the industry, not necessarily by vertical, but manufacturers, service providers, maybe which segment has had the biggest impact due to COVID?
So I mean, we always live in our headline bubble, right? A lot of companies put out only positive press releases. Most of the companies in the drone space are private companies. They don't have to necessarily release financials on a regular basis, and so they won't unless there's good news. So we have seen a lot of good data points from larger companies like DroneBase, Drone Deploy, are two that come to my mind, but I'm DroneUp as well, who have really taken this as an opportunity to kind of expand their offerings with these kind of more niche different use cases, and also just more activity on their platform. But if we actually look at kind of the businesses on both the agency users and then the service providers, overwhelmingly they're negative impacts. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no long-term benefit to this situation. I think long-term we'll see that more decisions are changed long-term, more mindsets are changed long-term than kind of the short-term ramifications. But in general, service providers are overwhelmingly saying, they lost jobs, or this kind of hit their projects, or hit budgets of their clients more so than it increased, or it didn't have any impact. In business agency users, it's a little bit of a different story. In some areas, it's more positive. Some areas it's more negative. Kind of the general rule is, if an agency spent, or a business agency spent more money on their drone program before already, then they're going to kind of benefit, or they're going to generally be more likely to benefit from COVID-19, just because their management has already bought into the program, and then this just makes them double down on that investment. But specifically if you're a younger drone program that's not spending so much, they saw overwhelmingly negative impacts.
So it seems like it's clearly tied to scale. I think when the pandemic first hit, I spoke to CJ about kind of a gutting of the middle that would most likely happen. But are you saying that this is going to affect people getting started? I mean, are they going to be closing up shop right because there's just no opportunities to kind of stay the tide?
Yeah, I mean, business agency users definitely, they'll continue on as long as their business continues. But on the service provider side, once again, it's very hard for us to estimate how many people are dropping out of the market due to a specific reason, because they just don't show up in the survey if that's the situation. So we can guess, but we can't necessarily prove.
Is that survivor's bias?
Yeah, there's the survivor's
classic
bias, which, but if we look at that, there is kind of this middle gap that is being hurt. I think that's a better way to kind of put it. that is being hurt and more negatively impacted. But overwhelmingly, even the people at the top were more likely to be negatively impacted. So there are unequal benefits. You just have to kind of be in the right niche and also be fully invested in this space and kind of deep into it and scaled out. And you'll pretty much weather the storm, though.
So if I was to give you $1 million of my own money, because I clearly have it, where would you put it? Which niche?
Well, I would go to Bali and retire.
Yeah.
But, all right, 100,000.
But no, I mean, in general, public safety surprisingly did pretty well during this time, which I think specifically thinking about the U.S. in particular was a bit surprising to me, just with all the public relations drama around defunding the police. What should we do with their funding? Should we cut them entirely? Should we limit it? And we could say that drones fit within this kind of purvey of demilitarizing or kind of de-conflicting technology, but you're always kind of initially worried, well, will this just scare people from purchasing any products that may be seen as militaristic? But we didn't really see that. And then obviously public safety has been really critical to fighting COVID-19 and the spread of that as well, and kind of policing communities. So yeah, that's one area as well to kind of be looking at.
We actually just posted an article today that the DJI reported that we, as a world, hit 500 lives saved with drones in public safety. So, another kind of a positive, another positive insight, positive piece of data on the drone industry that's pretty timely. Back to COVID, I think we talked a lot about impact on the private sector. How have we seen this kind of impact? Well, either drone programs within governments, but also just broader regulation. Maybe more specific to the U.S., just because that's what most of us are a little more familiar with. But do you think some of these waivers were able to be approved because of the situation, or do you think the kind of the maturation and the regulatory landscape and all the waivers that happened this year, that would have happened regardless of a pandemic or not?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I definitely think that there's been a lot more pressure on the FAA to kind of rush a lot of this, both to support kind of domestic players, and we're kind of seeing the 10 list are only domestic players, but then also to kind of drive more of these applications like delivery that are just make a lot of sense for COVID-19. But I'd say recently we've seen the FAA take up a lot of really logical, this just makes sense type of approach. I think it was just a week ago that Drone Seed was given kind of a blanket BVLOS waiver to kind of just spray tree seeds and plant wildland. And I think it was like, I forgot what state, but in general, I think this is just a great, it doesn't necessarily fit into the larger picture of regulations that they saw. I wouldn't guess that someday this year we would see that kind of blanket waiver, but this is a very common sense style way to regulate it. This is a net benefit application. There's very little risk there as well, just because of the situation that they're flying in, and it just makes a lot of sense. So I think there's been a lot more of that mindset to these regulations on delivery as well, that has been pretty positive. I mean, everyone in the industry always complains it could be faster. When is remote ID coming? They did promise by end of this year, so I'm still watching my.
They still have time.
They still have time though.
They'll do it at midnight, but on New Year's like they did last time.
Open some champagne. I'll get the champagne ready.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, in general, they've done a pretty good job. I mean, everyone always wants to poke fun at the FAA, but I think if you look at trends in other countries, America was just first in so many situations, and they're kind of still positioned to be. Doesn't mean that they're guaranteed to be, and there still needs to be a lot of effort to kind of promote the domestic industry. But it's been pretty good. I mean, I don't think we can complain on the regulatory side this year.
I've heard that a few times, actually. Some people, I know a couple of our legal constituents, some of our speakers who are lawyers, said they've actually been really impressed, and we're just with the FAA this year and what they've been able to get done, and they think that, kind of echoing your sentiment here.
Yeah, I think it's definitely been the FAA's work this year has probably been underrated. I mean, there's always a critic, right? But I think the people who are critical are still critical for reasons, and we don't know until it lands. So we gotta keep our comments close to our chest until we actually see it. But I guess my kind of controversial question is, when remote ID lands, is it going to save the drone industry, David?
I mean, probably not. I mean, it's a great first step. I think we'll see how exactly it's implemented. People always say it might kill the industry as well. I'm on a little bit more favorable approach to remote ID. I think it is critical to enabling the future. Are we going to see a drone rush because of remote ID? No.
Yeah.
I think overall you can say, if you take any one message from this podcast, there's no gold rush happening. You need to be really smart about how you act in this industry. And that's the same with the regulations. There's no one trick, one switch that the FAA needs to flip and we're all rolling in dough.
CJ, can you repost the report link in the chat here? We also, you could use the bit.ly that's kind of on the rotating banner, Mr. Perfect 182.
Yeah, and the report page is more about just the report itself, which is 129 pages, and I encourage kind of all the industry stakeholders to kind of look at that. But there's also a blog. Yeah, CJ just shared the blog post, which I think is more relevant for everyone, and then you can kind of see if the full report is something for you.
Right. So we got a question from Kristen from Canada. So she's going to dive into the report after the podcast, but does your research look into industry diversity? We're launching a survey this month to create the status of women in Canada's drone ecosystem, so we'd love to know if you captured info about women's roles, participation, paths of entry, and impact on COVID, and had the impact COVID had on their jobs and businesses.
Yeah, this is a really good question. Unfortunately, the answer is no. Just through our survey, we've tried to limit the questions as much as possible and try to get as far away from personally identifiable information, just because it gets people more comfortable with sharing kind of very detailed about their business. I think it's great, the survey that you're doing, and please send me a link. Just find me on Twitter at DroneAnalyst or Dave Benowitz, and I would love to actually share it out. I think the topic of diversity in the industry is really important. And, I'll just say from my experience, there's not enough females, or just in general, people of diversity in the industry. We're a panel of 3 white dudes. I kind of champion to have, we try. And I think there's something inherent to the industry and the industries we work in. And I had a really interesting conversation with Suzanne from API about this as well, as she's like one of the only females in the oil and gas industry. But it would be great to kind of see more diversity. I'd love to help you kind of measure how that small niche of the population is doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why we worked with, we continue to work with Sharon Rossmark of Women in Drones. And, we've taken pride in trying to get the percentages up. We've always overrepresented at the show, but it never kind of feels like enough. And it's interesting, though, how certain sectors seem to kind of push in this direction. But there's nothing about a drone that makes it specifically, a male kind of toy or business tool. I mean, it really is kind of an equalizer. So I'm excited to see more women enter the industry. So if Kristen wants to send that report over to us, we're happy to share it with our audience too.
Right. Yeah. We touched briefly on remote ID. If we do see that implemented before the end of the year, do you guys think there'll be kind of the impact will be different for hobbyists versus more commercial use cases? Will it create, I guess, maybe more of a barrier to entry if you're just a hobbyist, if you need to potentially register a drone for different flights, if you're just, flying in your yard or in a park, versus in the commercial side, maybe it's actually creating some sort of framework that people know what they can and can't do, and it will actually, spur some innovation or spur some more kind of drone programs.
Yeah, it really depends on how it's implemented.
Hmm.
And this is why remote ID is such a complicated topic to talk about. The difference in regulation, just like a sentence in this specific regulation, could change so much. It could be that there's a requirement for your drone to send out a Wi-Fi band, and it already has a Wi-Fi signal on its remote controller, and then anyone can install an app that can understand what's happening. Then there's almost no impact to the consumer. Maybe if it's not messaged correctly, it could scare some people away, but it's pretty much just drone registration that we already have. Then we could also have it where, they require some type of more complicated transmission system. Maybe it's, I don't know, based on some type of telecom system that we have today, and you have to pay monthly. And maybe that's the situation for commercial, and maybe it's a little bit more simple for hobbyists, but it's still an extra added cost. So I would just say it just depends so much on what the actual regulation ends up being. In general, I hope, and it kind of seems that a lot of the comments were pushing the FAA in this direction. I hope they've kind of adopted, is just on the hobbyist side, we're already kind of seeing that slowly diminish. And I think it's a really important segment of the market. And our report dives into this a lot more in more detail, that actually this hobbyist interest is really driving enterprise adoption as well. And so we do need to be worried that, if people aren't buying consumer drones, that we just will actually have less business adoption because less people are using and familiar with this technology, are comfortable with this technology being over their head.
I think that's really interesting. So we may see if there's more proliferation in consumer drones, the general public is more comfortable with them, more familiar with them, and then therefore you may see some more enterprise or commercial adoption. I think that's kind of an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, maybe installing an app on your phone and being able to see, okay, that's Joe Schmo's drone. He's telling me what he's doing. He added some notes there that, hey, I'm just taking photos of my house, and I thought it was over my house, so now I feel a bit more comfortable. Like that's, that's not bad. If it's at the point where this drone pilot has to pay $10 a month to install some type of specific transmission, or purchase a new drone at X% higher cost, then we have to be a little worried. So I just say, what is that cost to the hobbyist is really important and can change so much by specific pieces of the legislation.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've said before that the difference between $1 and free is $1 million. It really, when you look at even like any application strategy, charging for an app, it better be something that's really worth it. And usually, actually, what you're paying for is the human services that back that up, like the customer support. So I see what you're saying there, and actually, just any point where we could get more exposure and these things into more hands is really the most important thing, right? Familiarity, everybody knowing what's going on, because then things can move forward with confidence. Right now, it's still kind of, if you ask the average person, they're still talking about drones peeping in their windows. It's like, that might have, I mean, if there was really a concern, it would have been happening more often than we're seeing. And then secondly, privacy laws already cover that. I mean, you still get those comments to this day. So I think the more familiarity, the further we could get away from that, the more we can have an industry to talk about.
Yeah, I think we need a marketing wing for the industry as a whole, and to dispel myths, to educate. I mean, I don't know who's going to be responsible for that. Maybe Interdrone could take that up next year, but
yeah, give us a couple $1 million and we'll get right on that.
Yeah. We need to get all these new drone manufacturers to put it into a big pot.
Right.
Actually, there might be something to that.
It'll pay off down the line, right?
I mean, you've seen that in other industries where there's kind of like, I'm pretty sure the coffee lobby, Big Coffee, we'll call them, they do that where you'll see on the news, it's like coffee cures some type of heart disease. And you're like, where did this video package come from? And it's usually kind of one of those independent research kind of or institutions. Maybe the drone industry needs something like that, honestly. Putting together kind of pro drone material that can be distributed easily.
And, well, Mike, I bring up this example a few times, but you mentioned that you're out in Long Island here in New York. One of the utility companies was doing inspections with drones, and they were running ads, letting people know what they were doing, why they were doing it, to just create transparency and from their side, they're trying to build something that doesn't isn't met with public backlash, and they see a cost saving. They want to be able to keep doing it.
So,
Yeah.
No, go on.
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
No, I got a comment from Vic I'm going to voice, so go forward first.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and something that actually Romeo championed a lot with public safety entities was just a lot of them were doing an amazing job at having like a separate Twitter account just for their drone program. Mm-hmm. And they'll just tweet out, look, we're operating here today. You guys can mm-hmm. follow us. And they're very vocal about how exactly they're using drones and mm-hmm. actively going to their communities about this. We've always seen kind of the stereotype of, one local citizen who just gets really angry about everything and kind of shows up and just shuts everything down for no reason. And I think a lot of these public safety drone programs are pros at this type of local marketing that, mm-hmm. Maybe we all need to take into mind. Maybe these, utilities need to take this in mind as well, construction companies, etc.
Yeah. That's a good point.
So Vic's comment, if only there was a DSP group working to give the industry a voice, winky face. So
we got to give him a plug.
Yeah. If you don't know who Vic Moss is, please find him on social media. He's by far one of the largest pilot advocates out there.
You can also meet him next week.
That's right. Oh, we got him? Good.
Yeah. You meet him next week at Interdrone. So.
And then just a week ago, he launched the Dsp Alliance. Please don't kill me if I got the name wrong. I think it's dspalliance.org is their website. But we kind of have just a few weeks ago the first real industry body for drone service providers that we've ever had. So I know Vic did a really good job at kind of vocalizing to people in DC about the NDA bills and the NDA laws. And it's great to see more of these industry bodies kind of come together and voice the many and behind closed doors.
Absolutely. Especially on the early regulation, there was not enough pilot input on them. So it's nice to see it now. So we already got predictions for 2021, but how about dreams for 2021, David? What would you like to see? What would you like to be surprised by?
I'm way too focused on COVID and just the whole pandemic ending. It's hard to have drone dreams these days.
Yeah.
But
survival.
It'd be great to kind of see, survival. For me, just being able to go see my family again. For drone dreams, it'd be really exciting to see not just remote ID kind of finally come into place and have positive impacts, but also some type of new UTM proposal, getting closer to figuring out how this is going to all fit together. And then also drone deliveries, kind of hopefully a bit more test sites around that we can finally see how economical is this, how scalable is this, and kind of which areas is this really realistic for us to implement.
Right. David, you, surveying this survey had respondents from 110 different countries. Are there any, I think a lot of us are so familiar with the US regulation, all the different bodies involved here. Are there any international jurisdictions or countries or even different territories that are doing some really interesting things in drones that maybe some of us aren't aware of?
Yeah, the US is really at the forefront overall. There are a few small areas that are highly urban, like Singapore, that are very progressive in the way that they approach it. I think literally just yesterday, they announced they're going to try to at least do some type of kind of passenger delivery, passenger traffic system by 2024. And I think that's only if you have a government focus only on one city is that really feasible in that type of time frame. There's that. Australia has always been a really good place to look at, but if you look through their recent regulations and the direction that they're projecting forward, they actually call out the FAA and kind of say, we want to follow you. And I think that's great. We might say that that's kind of, pushing the buck onto the US or the FAA, but, we kind of want to see, especially with UTM and with remote ID, one type of standard really come into place. And so I prefer not to see too much innovation globally in the regulatory space. If we're talking about who's moving, we are seeing the European Union move really fast with the EASA regulations. And that's going to be a really big boon for that market. India is as well. And actually, I think there's also an opportunity for India to become the drone industry being really politicized by their prime minister and being a really big industry for them to grow as well. It's still too early to say. But that's kind of where I'm looking. I'm hoping everyone has a very similar path to how to solve the safety problems, how to solve the integration problems, and how to also scale up everything.
Because so let's say the US implements a remote ID policy, India implements a remote ID policy, and they're very different. What implications does that have for the software and hardware providers who are designing drones, who, for it may be DJI or a Skydio or a Unique Parrot, who says, okay, I need to design a drone that's compatible with this remote ID system and then this one, because these are both big markets where I sell my products.
Yeah, I mean, there's one element of this, which is just the cost and kind of it being a PETA, to not say the full term, which is you're going to start to have these SKUs that are per market. And there are some requirements on size that it's already getting like that with like the Mavic Mini in Japan is 200 grams. Everywhere else is 249 grams, 199, 249 on the size there. But, that would be just a magnitude larger in kind of requirements. And then specifically, we look at most of the industry is not DJI. How much can they really afford to kind of split their manufacturing line when they just built their manufacturing line in the first place and really scale that out? So, if we do see that type of direction in the market, we'll see it favor the big player. And I'm saying singular player. And, that'll be kind of how it works. For the software side, we'll see generally how people are kind of seeing this forward. We'll probably see one or two big software players in each region, which kind of makes sense. If there's some type of local requirement in India and you want to have it available in the multitude of Indian languages, we're probably going to have a domestic player there regardless of the actual local requirement.
Mm-hmm. And because I would also assume that the government will have to be working pretty closely with those big players in the software side, and definitely easier to be doing that if it is a local company, like you're saying.
Yeah, or being
definitely
able to talk with those regulators about what the precise needs are, right?
Yeah.
We all need a
Concerns.
lobbyist.
Yeah. Back to Singapore, I want to quote Tony Basil, who was on the podcast 2 weeks ago. He said, we were pointing out Singapore and some of their progress, and he's doing great work up in New York at the test site. And he said, yeah, but Singapore doesn't have the FAA, which was pretty funny. So his point is that, they don't have to deal with a lot of the regulations that, they don't have as complex of an airspace as we do here in the States.
Yeah. So, I mean, is there opportunity there for innovation that we can quickly copy, which, I know America likes to be first at things, but I mean, is there kind of just innovation happening elsewhere without the scale of America that is easy to kind of scale up here and really innovate?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few players in the Southeast Asian market that are really interesting, and I think are just overall really competent that, could potentially move more globally. But being in Southeast Asia is a very hard market to expand into. In general, it's really hard to expand into China, just because of the cultural barrier actually between like a Singapore and a China. We kind of see them as like, they're all ethnically kind of similar. But when it comes down to business practices and how business is done in B2B is night and day.
It's drastic, right?
Interesting.
Yeah. And so, there's a lot of these smaller companies, and, specifically in these regions. I mean, I want to shout out a few, but the names kind of, it's late at night, so I can't quite remember that.
Sorry.
But for a lot of them, it would be great to see them move more internationally, and a lot of them have this strain on them, which is you only have this one or two very small markets. So you do have to kind of be very vertically integrated across different areas of the market. I think there's a lot of value into that if they were to scale more globally. So I would love to see these companies kind of reach out a bit more. We'll see that trend maybe, hopefully. But it does kind of depend, to your point, on the regulations. Or are they kind of copy and paste? Are they very different as well?
Right, because regulation is nuanced. Oh, we got another question. I thought we were going to close out. But will ICAO ever get around to putting their weight behind worldwide drone regulations? Can't we follow manned aviation in this aspect? That is a fantastic question, and that is from Vic.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. You know, my specialty is not necessarily focused on kind of hardware standards and requirements on that side. And theoretically speaking, it would be great to kind of see that trajectory and move. I think specifically on the safety side, you know, we're seeing different localities value and measure safety differently, and that could eventually lead to different ways that hardware is manufactured and also maintained, and that would be really interesting and confusing as well. Yeah, it would be great to see this type of more global approach. I always kind of am worried just from a larger perspective of borrowing too much from manned aviation, just because so much of that is built on safety as number one, and safety should be, you know, top of our list. But we also have to recognize that drones just have a different, you know, safety risk to the flights themselves.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we might see too much of a bend towards that safety risk instead of economic risk, just because regulators or regulatory bodies don't even really know how to value something other than just by risk. You know, when we talk about aviation flights, the way that, for example, CASA in Australia collects data, it's pretty much only safety data. They don't really care that much about the growth of the market as much. And I'm generalizing here. But if you look at the data that even they collect that they believe is kind of critical to the market growth, is all on safety. So, you know, there's a different approach that needs to be taken with drones because it is a new market with a lot of economic opportunities as well. So I'd always just err towards, let's be a little careful about getting too close to manned aviation.
So this is kind of purely speculation, but it's kind of something that I always have noticed about the industry and just in tech in general. I mean, sort of some of the advantage that we get from this is actually the fact that it's not uniform, right? The fact that the technology is distributed, it's more local in its execution. So that we might run into things where if you try to kind of apply some uniformity, other than in the most broad sense, it would be detrimental to those kind of local use cases you were talking about. And I think of kind of like the states' rights versus federal rights battle over, you know, can I decide what this drone is allowed to do within this airspace? And yeah, for general safety, I think it totally matters. But I mean, you don't want to stop use cases that would be beneficial to a specific country within their regulatory framework just to say that we followed manned aviation. Maybe, I don't know. I'd like to talk with you more about that Vic, and find out more about the history of ICAO before I comment further. Maybe we'll have that conversation at the show.
Yeah.
And
I think Vic would be a great person to have to talk about that in more detail.
Yeah. And then we got Scott. Scott showed up. I was wondering when I was going to see you. So will there be a global recognition of U.S. type certifications? So the recent... Actually, if you have any comments on type certification, we'd like that. I had to speak to it in mostly ignorance last week, but I think it's an important issue that we need more detail on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also, you know, not deeply familiar with type certification. I've never kind of gone through that process in my history. You know, I've obviously studied up on it and have kind of spoken to a few people who are going through that process. And I haven't read all 10 of the companies that now have kind of their specific paths to type certification. I'm still getting caught up on that. Since I've just finished the big report, I can now catch up on my reading list. You know, I think to answer the larger question on, you know, will the U.S. type certification be globally recognized? You know, I'd say it's kind of a big question of how much do people trust the FAA and the U.S. government more broadly? And I think just generally speaking, and we're not going to get political here, you know, we've seen that kind of wane a little bit in trust overall to U.S. being kind of the leader in what is the direction of the world on kind of specific key areas. But then also we've seen that, especially with the Boeing Max, the FAA has also weakened in kind of their specific duties necessarily, or kind of people's view of them more globally. So I wouldn't, you know, immediately assume that that's the next path that we're going to see that in the next 2 to 3 years. You know, I assume every country will kind of have their own type of similar certification and they'll go through their process. And, you know, maybe we'll see that come more closely together globally in the future. But yeah, I don't see that as a short-term outcome necessarily. We are seeing a lot of different countries work with US players like Wing in Australia as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if they end up getting type certification at very similar times, and it might look like a global recognition, but it's not. So it'll be interesting to see how it shakes out.
Yeah, I'm really interested in type certification because it's pretty clear that the drone has to meet the spec to get the certification. But there's also a political aspect to it, right? How do you even get in front of the right people? Do you have the right data? Do you have the ability to kind of get through the process, or the patience to get through that process? And then, do you bet on getting through that process? Do you go to a different country where you think you have a better shot? So I think everybody should keep their eyes on type certs in general, because that'll make a determination for certain businesses to just say, I could pick up this type cert drone. It's good for this operation. Boom, we're ready to roll. It might have some economic impact.
Right.
Yeah, there's also a risk here, which is, historically speaking, with manned aviation, type certification would kind of lock the components, the design, the behavior of the aircraft as well. And so it was really interesting to look at. Amazon published, I think at the end of last year, their kind of big complaint about type certification with the FAA, saying, we kind of need more flexibility. If we deploy our own drone delivery fleet with type certification, we want to be able to improve parts over time and improve the performance over time. And that also requires that we have some more fluidity. I do know that they've also really recently as well kind of released new guidelines on how they want to take type certification for small unmanned aircraft. Hopefully it's moving in this direction of more fluidity. This industry will inherently, just by the nature of the technology, I think will always be improving when a fleet is deployed, just because of the nature of it from an economic perspective. And so, hopefully we kind of get that in mind too.
So Daniel Brinley, just to show that we don't shy away from controversial questions or statements, the biggest threat to the U.S. market is the FAA, an agency that could not keep people flying on the Boeing 737 MAX planes safe. FAA is also the most bureaucratic. I think we get the point there. But I think the reason I even bring it up is because the 737 kind of incident, I think, does speak to, are there enough hands at the FAA to handle that level of fluidity, though? There has to be some oversight for safety reasons, and are there enough hands, not just the FAA, but in regulatory bodies worldwide, to actually handle the rate that the technology is able to move here? And it's not like software where we can kind of tolerate. There's some question about that. Tolerate the kind of societal impacts. There's actual safety impacts here. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's always good to have kind of a larger perspective of kind of the federal government and what's happening in other federal agencies. I think if you were to look at their track record versus a lot of other agencies that have just been paused for 4-year gaps, and we see this is not a Republican or a Democrat thing. It's like on and off with every executive agency. The FAA at least has been more stable and kind of pushing forward, regardless of the political situation. So I would say they're not killing the industry. We could always see regulations be better. When we think of a new market, everyone sees the dream of autonomous whatever, kind of the end solution, but it takes a long time to get there. And the regulatory bodies do need to take their time to really balance all of these different influences and different stakeholders as well. So I think it's tough. Everything could always be better. I think, CJ, we were talking about this before. When you're preparing for an event, there's always more you could do with regulations as well. Regulations could always be released earlier and be more defined as well. It's just not really how these kind of things actually come into place.
Mm-hmm. How much is, like, back to the FAA, hardware versus software? At least from my understanding, it seems like the Boeing, the 737 MAX, the crashes were more software related. As we get to more and more like deeply sophisticated software, is that challenging at all for the FAA to kind of keep up with that innovation? It seems like they were built back when it was all hardware, right? Like you're expecting the rivets on a plane, the engines on these planes. And now it seems like we're getting so deep into software. Did they need to change maybe to try to keep up with what's happening?
They have processes for evaluating the software, but software can be hard that way. I mean, do you think Facebook knows what's going on with half their code? I mean,
right.
I mean, they actually today they might, because they unified the back end between the three apps. But if you were to go back 2 years ago, it was probably a rat's nest. And it's just, software can have ramifications down the line, because you keep building on it, right? And something that was written on like the core library that's still being used today, when a float goes the wrong direction, suddenly that causes a catastrophic failure. So, I mean, it's really time you need to evaluate software, and that I don't think anybody's going to be happy with that answer, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Right.
But I think the good thing with drones, at least, is that they're small enough where we could operate them in test sites that have controlled environments more so than we might see elsewhere. So I think with software, it's like, are we going to have the FAA or any regulatory body review every line of code and kind of do that level of review before a product goes and meets type certification or anything else? Probably not. Right. But I think it'll be more of, you have to have X amount of flights in X amount of conditions, and X% of them need to, succeed. Mm-hmm. And hopefully they're more measuring the failure rate and it's 0.001. But, I think that's the only way to kind of get there as well. Right. From my understanding today, we're not getting into that level of detail with the drones that we have in the market. And so we have seen some areas where, there were reports of drones falling out of the sky in specific models, specific brands as well. And, this type of relationship with the regulatory body and hopefully collecting data in that manner will eventually kind of become standard in all commercial aircraft. And, let's make sure these things are safe when we get to that level. It's not a huge thing that needs to be changed. It's just the way that they approach it.
I think back to like type certification, I think we've heard Chris Anderson say this, but, and to what you're saying, the FAA doesn't need to know what's in every line of code, but if you say your drone is going to do this and you can do that X percentage, that's what we care about. So to your point, the FAA doesn't need to get that deep in the weeds. If, if you can demonstrate it with your flight hours, demonstrate it with your testing and get it to a certain level of success, that, that will be an approved kind of use case.
Yeah, Scott's bringing up a good point. The level of review depends on the level of complexity and the risk, right? Mm-hmm. So if it's a piece of software that isn't going to actually impact the operation, it fails, the FAA might not even have to look at it, right? Because it's not critical to the flight safety. And, if mm-hmm. it's something like the MAX incident, I don't know where the failures were, but I think some of them were also bureaucratic. It was and also kind of business practices, where they in the outside of even the United States, right, where they were selling these things and how they sold the product and described to the pilots how to adapt to that situation, and then pilot training on top of that. It was really a confluence of multiple factors that brought those planes down and sadly lost those lives. But it definitely, I think, opened the door for, we need to pay more attention to this, and it's kind of tough when you have such a large manufacturer that's quite national, like Boeing, right? They almost are the U.S. plane manufacturer for commercial aircraft.
There's two options, right?
Yeah. Does that relationship make it harder, right? Does that make, the kind of oversight more casual than it should be? I mean, probably, but I'm not in those rooms, so I don't know. This is a great question from Daniel. China dominates the supply chain for drones. How can any U.S. drone maker even begin to compete with Chinese drones?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The time and patience and investment. I do like what the DoD has been doing with the Blue SUS group. As much as I dislike country of origin bans, I think this type of creating a small protected market that the federal government will pay for makes sense. And it'll also cause signals throughout the rest of the market. But, we can see that as kind of the DoD subsidizing the U.S. domestic supply chain for the rest of us. It's going to take time for it to really get there. I mean, the volume that they're going to be producing with that small segment of the market isn't at the level of like a DJI Mavic, for example. But it's one step to getting there. So yeah, and I think just the great thing is that we're seeing a lot of different players come into the market, and they're all investing at the same time. So we'll kind of see more of that there. It's going to take time though.
So CJ, we've been on the stream long enough that we're getting spam bots from Twitch because we've had enough sustained viewers. They just tend to show up then. You want to take us out, and we'll say bye to David for now, but we'll see him at Interdrone, right?
Yeah. I was going to say, David, thanks for staying long. I think we're almost at 90, 100 minutes now. So there's a lot to talk about. If anybody's tuning in, you'll see the link in the bottom right quadrant that's rotating. That's where you can learn more about the report. We also put the blog post in the chat here, which has kind of 4 key takeaways, some nice data points, and then again a link to download and learn more. So, David, any kind of final thoughts before we close out? I know we've touched on a lot, but any final thoughts before we let you go? And you probably need to get to sleep soon, being out there in Shenzhen.
Well, I just appreciate the conversation, and thank you guys for asking questions, for everyone that tuned in. We kind of went on a bit of a marathon there. It's been a pleasure to chat with you guys, and kind of once again, thanks for hosting this type of platform. I think it's really interesting to have these type of conversations in the drone industry. Just as we mentioned, so much of it is just kind of blanket press releases and not more of the nuance, and it's good to get into those details. Everyone, you can always follow DroneAnalyst.com and kind of visit us, or on Twitter. We're always looking to kind of have a voice and kind of actually have a two-way discussion as well. So if there's anything you thought that I talked about that you have different takes on, just tweet at us, and I'm more than willing to have a more deeper conversation about it.
Great. Yeah, thanks again for joining us and sharing some of the insight. And everybody go check out the report. Just incredible amount of information there, and kind of a great way to wrap up this year. I know this has been a crazy year for a lot of us. If you are tuning in live, we appreciate your questions. This will be the new format for the podcast, so definitely keep tuning in. We love your questions, so keep them coming. Check out the report, and then please, everybody, join us at Interdrone Online next week, December 15th through 17th. You can learn more about tickets on interdrone.com. And we will see everybody on the next podcast. Thanks again, David.
Thanks.